We are almost exactly 3 weeks away from kickoff. And a week ago on Big Red Rant, we discussed Nebraska's new look offense under Dana Holgorsen. An offense that has had a lot of buzz and is drawing a lot of praise here in the preseason. Which to me, Gary, really raises the concern of if the offense is supposed to be so great, I would think the most likely thing that seemingly could hold Nebraska back this year is going to be the defense. Suppose it could be special teams, but it's been decent and is expected to get better. Injuries would be the other thing that I didn't even really want to mention. But that question is huge. Like, how good can we or should we expect this defense to be this year? I know you and I both loved Tony White last season and for his entire time with the Huskers, but you happen to be a Bills fan that was already familiar with John Butler, so I'll ask you. After seeing the beginning of his DC tenure during the Pinstripe Bowl, everything else we've learned in the preseason since then, how different do you think that his version of the 3-3-5 will be, and how?
I think it'll be pretty different, man. I think you're going to see a lot more man and a lot more blitzes than you saw with Tony White. I'm not too worried about the defense, whether it's going to be good or bad. I'm more concerned with how long until it's good, if that makes sense. There's a lot of new guys coming in, but there's a lot of guys returning that were on the team, just not a ton of starters. Most of the secondary is returning all the starters, or the majority of the starters. Andrew Marshall seems like he's going to be the obvious number 2 corner. He's about the only change in the secondary. The concern for me is you've got guys like I like that Butler kept the 3-3-5, makes it much simpler, kind of like we're talking about with Holgerson last year, where he tried to learn the verbiage instead of implementing his own. And even this year, it's not a drastic change from what I'm hearing. I like that on the defensive side, but it's going to be different play to play because I think you're going to see a lot of 5 and even 6-man rushes on the quarterback. The concern in that area for me is Nebraska seemed to really struggle in man-to-man defense last year. But a big part of that, I feel, is because they did a lot of it with the linebackers. And I think if you have an effective blitz, and that's where a lot of these transfers coming in and having Javen Wright healthy back in there at linebacker, things like that are going to help. You can help your secondary by getting pressure to the quarterback. It's really, really difficult to play man for any stretch of time in the secondary when the quarterback has time to pick the defense apart and wait for the throw he wants, as opposed to he's under pressure or has to be flushed or moved around the pocket, and certain parts of the field are automatically cut off. So I think it'll be effective. I think the defense will be good. I think you have more speed and more athleticism now than you did before. I don't think you have the raw power, especially on the defensive line with Hutmacher and Ty Robinson being gone and Butler. But I think when you look at some of the guys that were brought in, a couple of them are specific, like speed in guys that, are pass rushers. I know you really like Watson Trent. I think he's going to be a tackling machine that you can kind of leave in the middle and let your outside linebackers blitz, pose a threat of blitzing, be in disguises. He's going to do different looks. Things are going to be more exotic type blitzes. I wouldn't be surprised if you see corners and maybe even where Hartzog's going to play that kind of nickel spot. He's more of like a hybrid safety corner. I wouldn't be surprised if you see him on blitzes in different situations. So I think it's going to be a different look. I think there's going to be a lot less of the giant cushion pre-snap from the DBs to the receivers, and hopefully a mixture of a little bit more. Man's one thing, press is another thing, but I think you'll see a little bit more press, or at least the look of that, to where the quarterback's going to feel like he doesn't have quite as much time, and he definitely shouldn't have quite as much space for his receivers pre-snap. So things like that, I think, will be effective, especially early on. It's just a matter of how effective can your main down guys on the line be on their own, to where it's that much more of an issue when you're sending an extra rusher or 2 extra rushers, or if you're having success with that and you start looking like you're going to do that and you back them off, can you force them to throw into some bad spots? But I'm not as worried that it's going to be bad. I'm just leery of how long into the season we get before it really starts clicking, and not just for the players, but for the coaches to see, okay, in these situations, we want this personnel. In these situations, we want that personnel. These guys work well together. Those types of things. I think you're going to see fall offs in certain things where, like for most of the season, our run defense was really good. There was a couple games that were bad. One was really, really bad, but maybe the run defense isn't quite as stifling, but also you probably aren't giving up 7 yards automatically on every pass play. And hopefully you're getting more sacks throughout the game, throughout the season, which, you know, best case scenario starts turning into more turnovers. I don't know that I would expect crazy different results one way or the other. Just again, kind of a timeline thing for me is more what I'm looking towards.
I'm excited about the speed on the edges for potential quarterback pressure and sacks and stuff, but it just sucks that we're in the Big Ten and we're losing our big interior guys because running the ball is so important in our conference, and it just seems like finally we had gotten the big guys to stop that. I hope that that's not the weakness of the defense. If anything looks like it could be, to me, that's the weakest spot. That was actually a question I wanted to ask you, but also strongest. What do you see the strongest point of the defense being this season and the weakest?
The weakest is tough. I tend to agree with you on the defensive line. I think the strongest point of the overall defense is going to be the depth. I think there'll be times in the season where either the starters have changed or the amount of plays guys are getting, maybe guys who don't start are getting big minutes, big plays because of the rotations they'll be able to do that in, last year and especially the year before, maybe it was a little more limited level wise. Like if you're talking D line, linebacker, defensive backs, I think the strength is going to be the linebacker position because I feel like that's really deep and very athletic. I was talking to you before, like John Bullock was really good, top tackler on the team, very high football IQ, not the fastest, definitely not the most athletic, but didn't need to be, was in the right place, the right time. We've had other, linebackers that are that style where they're very, very consistent producer, if that makes sense. Like they don't get out of position, very gap discipline, pretty sure-handed tacklers, not a lot of missed tackles. But I think now you're going to have a group of guys where there's going to be a big improvement in speed, definitely a big improvement in athleticism, which gives you a little more versatility if you do end up in situations, if a team's going tempo on you and you have linebackers that are going to have to cover tight ends and running backs and maybe even some slot guys, things like that, where it's not quite as much of a mismatch. And then again, back to the depth thing, you can just keep changing those guys out. I think the defensive line is going to have to play a little bit different style as far as mainly pass rush. One thing that I don't think it's talked about enough is how often Robinson in particular was double teamed and still was able to get pressure on the quarterback. Like, I don't know. Riley Van Poppel, for example, he's not small. He's like 6'5", 290, something like that. He's probably going to be closer to 300. Judy, I think, is a little bit shorter and lighter than him, but not much. You're not going to have those massive guys. I would assume not the same amount of power, but probably a little more athletic, which I think if you use them a little bit different or play to their strengths, you can take advantage of that. You don't have to just rely on the fact that we need more size and power. There's things you can do with athletic, speedier guys. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm keeping in mind when I'm saying how long it takes for the defense to come together, but then also how well the secondary can pick up in playing a lot of man, because last year it was a big problem when they were in those types of situations, which I felt was a big reason why you didn't see a ton of blitzing. But again, the two kind of go hand in hand. But the strength I would assume going in is going to be your linebackers, just the speed and athleticism, the depth, and kind of a toss-up weakness-wise between if the secondary, whichever one is last, whether it's the defensive line having some continuity and figuring out what works well and what doesn't, and if the secondary, how quick they can pick up and be, obviously better than serviceable if you're going to be man heavy, but be at least above average in man-to-man situations. But where would you say the biggest weakness or your biggest concern on defense is going in?
Definitely most concerned about the defensive line, but that doesn't make me special. I think everybody's in that boat for the most part. And then I'm really intrigued by the speed of our linebackers and the depth of our secondary. And I'm getting more excited about individual players than usual. The portal is turning our roster construction into what I've kind of always hoped it would be, us being able to attract top talent. That's what we got when we went and paid for Marquise Watson-Trent. You mentioned that I'm high on him. He's one of my favorites going into this season. The other person that I'm most excited to watch play, I think, is Andrew Marshall. Both of us watch a lot of Husker Online, and I can't remember if it was Callahan or Sip, maybe even it was Evil Sip, but somebody was mentioning that they heard that Andrew Marshall is an NFL player. And so that's got me excited. Are there any players on this defense that you're really excited about specifically?
Yeah, I like what I'm hearing and what little bit I've been able to see about Marshall as well. I'm always pretty dialed in the secondary. I think Watson Trent is the most unquestionable, or like the where you can put the majority of your eggs in that basket that he's going to pan out and be worth the money and going out in the offseason and picking up. I'm mostly anticipating or kind of excited to see what Winery and McCullough look like, just because of one, how highly touted they've been both since they were high schoolers, but throughout what they've done, the speed, the athleticism. I mean, you just look at them, they just both of them kind of look like freaks. So I'm curious with utilizing them in pass rush more, being able to use them in multiple areas, and neither one of them seems like one trick ponies. Like Winery seems to be more of your typical edge speed pass rusher, but with that size and that speed and athleticism, I think he's the only thing that would really hold himself back as far as how well he can get the playbook down and do things like that. He just seems like he's too physically gifted to not warrant a lot of minutes. And then especially if you got some packages where you have Cam Leonard on the opposite side of him, I just think that's basically impossible for bigger linemen to be able to pick those guys up in speed rush type situations. So, and Cam's another one. I felt like there was a lot of times last year where I would have liked to have seen him in certain games more than he was in. So I think with him kind of going in, looking like he's going to be day one starter, that we'll see him for more plays. But it's kind of that outside back, but then the edge guys, I'm really curious to see how well they pan out and how much difference they can make the defense, especially the line look in pass rush situations and containing backs, not letting things get on the outside of them.
So the team's suffered a few injuries in camp, namely, and I think most recently, Bly Hill. Sucks, man. He just
Yeah.
seems like he is a little injury prone. Be completely honest. I just hope the best for him. Hopefully we can get him on the field at some point. But he's still got a lot of eligibility left, so I'm not that worried about it. Going into depth though a little bit more with the secondary, other than Wright and Marshall, who do you see stepping up this season, if anybody?
Honestly, man, I kind of expect at some point, whether it's because of more playtime because of injuries or just earning their way into more time through rotation and taking more and more plays from other guys. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Amari Sanders kind of break out. A lot of kind of expectations and talked about his athletic, gifts, if you want to call it that. But I think there's going to be more need for it, more rotation, especially if you got guys running man a lot. There's a lot more effort and energy spent on each play from guy to guy than there is in zone. So there's going to have to be some depth there, some rotation. And I think you're going to see guys that people aren't talking about. Derek Branch is probably another one. I don't know that it'll be a breakout type situation, but I'm really curious to see how Mario Buford plays. I've heard Marquise Buford talking about how he thinks he's as good or right on par with how good he is, but they have different styles. And, obviously we haven't seen a ton from him with him being, just a sophomore and not a starter or anything. But I'm really interested to see what his style's like when he gets in there. So I know we watched the Butler press conference, and then when Addison, the defensive back coach, was talking, both of them touched on the physicalness that needs to happen from the secondary, and it's some of those guys that I'm curious to see. It's kind of a fine line you have to walk as a DB, being physical, especially in today's football, and especially for some reason as Nebraska when flags are thrown constantly. But can you be physical without drawing a lot of flags and make it really tough for receivers to get in and out of their breaks? And I think guys like that are more kind of seem like they're more physical when you go back and watch some of their other film, how that's integrated into the defense, either overall or situationally. So I just real curious to see what it looks like as they go through the depths, as they go through the twos and some of the threes. And he talks about they're interchanging. They're not just going, okay, the ones go, now the twos go, now the threes. They're mixing and matching almost like a basketball coach would play with the roster to see what the rotations look like, what you get from different guys at different positions. So definitely looking forward to that as when it comes to the secondary.